I'm going to discuss the chemical basis of life. And in order for us to understand higher chemistry and life itself, we must understand first the basics of chemistry. We have different terms here to ponder. So when we are talking with matter, it is anything that occupies space and has mass. And mass refers to the quantity of matter in any body. And mass is different from weight because weight refers to the gravitational attraction exerted by large body of matter on an object. So that means weight depends upon the distance of the body from the center of the earth, and so may vary from place to place, whereas mass of the body is constant. We have several properties of matter. One is its physical properties. Physical properties of matter which can be observed without changing the substance into some new kind of matter. For example, tearing of the paper. Number 2, we have the chemical properties. For the chemical properties, this can be observed only when the substance undergoes a change of composition. Example of this will be the burning of wood. Perhaps you've encountered already the physical states of matter. Generally, it is gas, liquid, and solids. So, when we say gases, neither have definite shape nor definite volume. Liquids have definite volume, but no definite shape. They just follow the shape of the container. And lastly, solids have definite volume and definite shape. Also, we have atoms and elements. Atoms are basic building block of matter and they are extremely small. And we have different parts of an atom. Number 1, we have the nucleus. The nucleus is a tiny central part of atom and it contains the protons and the neutrons. So, another, we have subatomic particles. And these are protons, neutrons, and electrons. These are basic principles. Protons are positively charged particles of an atom. The neutrons are neutral particle of an atom, while electrons are negatively charged particles of an atom. And electrons are found outside and revolving around the nucleus. So this illustration depicts the tiny dense nucleus consists of positively charged protons and uncharged neutrons. Most of the volume of an atom is occupied by rapidly moving negatively charged electrons, which can be represented as an electron cloud in this portion. So that is why some of scientists have jokes. They said that I love you with very subatomic particle of my body. To explain further, so the atomic number constitutes the protons. And the atomic mass is the total number of protons and neutrons. So this one is protons plus neutrons is equal to its atomic mass, and the number of protons is equal into its atomic number. How about the chemical bonds? In chemical bonds, these usually occurs when the outermost electrons are transferred or shared between atoms. And we have the term ionic bond or ionic bonding. This ionic bonding is the attraction between two oppositely charged ions. Like for example, the attraction between the sodium ion and the chlorine ion or the chloride ion. The sodium is positively charged and the chlorine is negatively charged. And ion are charged particles that are important, of course, in ionic bonding. This illustration depicts the reaction of the sodium atom and a chloride atom. During the reaction of sodium and the chlorine atom, the sodium atom loses electron and the chlorine atom gains electron. Another type of bonding is the covalent bonding. This covalent bonding occurs when an atom shares one or more pairs of its electrons. Example is the hydrogen molecule. The third one is a polar covalent bonds. Polar covalent bonds has an equal sharing of electrons as to the bondings of water. Polar molecules are said to be asymmetrical electrical charge, and the nonpolar molecules has a symmetrical electrical charge. Observe that the two hydrogen atoms do not interact because they are too far apart, while the positively charged nucleus of each hydrogen atom begins to attract the electrons of the other. So in this portion. And later on, that covalent bonding forms when the electrons are shared between the nuclei because the electrons are equally attracted to each nucleus. This one illustrates a polar covalent bonds as to the bonding of the molecules of water with two hydrogens and one oxygen. Another, we have hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds because polar molecules have a positive end and a negative end. Hydrogen bonds forms when positive end of one polar molecule is weakly attached or attracted to a negative end of another polar molecule. Usually, hydrogen bonding are weaker bond than the ionic or covalent bond. Observe that the positive hydrogen part of one water molecule forms a hydrogen bond with the negative oxygen part of another water molecule. As a result, hydrogen bonds hold the water molecules together. We move further regarding with molecules and compounds. When we say molecule, it's two or more atoms chemically combined. This is, for example, water. And when we say compound, it's a chemical combination of two or more different types of atoms. Example, the NaCl or the sodium chloride. In living organisms, there are chemical reactions that is actually happening inside their body. So, what are these chemical reactions? Chemical reactions are the formation or breaking of the chemical bonds. In every reaction, there are reactants and products. When we say reactants, these are what is put into reaction, and the products are the end results of the reaction. For example, the A and B are the reactants, and the C and the D are the products. The arrow here signifies the direction of the reaction. We have types of chemical reactions. Number one, we have the synthesis reaction. So that means it's a building a new molecule, and it usually requires energy. Just like, for example, in forming adenosine triphosphate, we need a reactants that are adenosine diphosphate and a phosphorus. Another, we have the decomposition reaction, which is usually breakdown of the molecule and usually energy releasing reaction. Like, for example, when you break ATP, you will produce adenosine diphosphate and phosphorus. This illustration here depicts the synthesis and decomposition reaction. So letter A here, which produce actually an energy, is an example of a decomposition reaction, and letter B that requires energy is an example of synthesis reaction. Another, we have exchange reaction. When we say exchange reaction, combination of the synthesis and decomposition reaction. Another is that an enzyme. Enzymes are proteins that are usually that helps in speeding up the reactions by increasing the activation energy in the reaction. Usually, enzymes has binding sites on its surface, and which are usually specific. That means if this will not match on the binding sites of the enzyme, there will be no reaction. Simple words that we need to define: an energy. Energy is the ability to do work. And we have kinetic energy, which is an energy in motion, and potential energy, which is a stored energy. Chemical energy, on the other hand, is an energy stored in chemical bonds, particularly in food. That is why when we are hungry, we don't have energy. But when we eat food and we break the food into simpler substances that can be absorbed by our cells, then therefore we have energy to do work. And as what I've mentioned earlier, this energy can be utilized by our body through several reactions. But before that, of course, we have the glucose, which is a sugar found in our foods, and glucose is used to make that energy in a form of adenosine triphosphate. Glycogen is a stored glucose, usually in the liver and in the skeletal muscle and fats of our body. Because of this glycogen, because of this stored glycogen in our liver and other parts of our body, when we are hungry, we don't die directly. Because glycogen will be converted into glucose later on, so that we can still survive in other succeeding hours without eating. This ATP is adenosine triphosphate. This is actually a stored energy in our body, particularly in our living system for the animals and plants. When ATP is broken down, it releases energy. So this is the structure of our adenosine triphosphate, that wherein the adenine is attached to a ribose sugar and attached to the three phosphate groups. Of course, when we are talking with chemistry, we do not forget acids and bases. Acids, these are the one that donates H plus, or the proton, and below 7 is acidic. Example of acids is your hydrochloric acid in our stomach. Bases accepts hydrogen or H plus, and usually the pH is above 7. Example of a strong base is your sodium hydroxide, and the neutral pH is 7. This illustration is a pH scale where it ranges from 0 to 14. As what we have discussed earlier, the neutral pH is 7, and our blood is slightly basic, and our stomach acid is pH 1. That means very acidic. And for example, we have here the baking soda, which is 9 in pH. In a living matter, it composed usually of 99% of elements. These are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And the elements which are present in living organism in smaller amount: hydrogen, which is present in most organic compounds and component of water. We all know that water is very important for living organisms. Also carbon in organic chemistry as a backbone of organic molecules that can form bonds with other atoms. Another, we have nitrogen, which is a component of all proteins and nucleic acids. Oxygen is needed in cellular respiration, present in most organic compound, and present also in water. Also, we have sodium, which is a principal positive ion in interstitial tissue, which is needed in fluid balance and nerve impulse conduction. Remember the sodium-potassium pump. Another, we have magnesium, which is needed in blood and body tissues and components of most enzymes and chlorophylls. Another, we have phosphorus, components of nucleic acids and bones, which is important in energy transfer. Sulfur, which is also component of proteins. That is why rotting meat has a pungent smell because of the sulfur. Another, chlorine, which is a principal negative ion of interstitial fluid, which is important also in fluid balance. We have also potassium, which is a principal positive ion in the cells, needed in nerve functions and muscular contraction. That is why there are conditions known as your hypokalemia, wherein low level of potassium, and some patients cannot stand because of this low potassium, because of its function in the muscular contraction. Another, we have calcium, which is prominently present in bones, teeth, and needed in muscle contraction and blood clotting. And we have also iron, which is part of our hemoglobin and myoglobin and certain enzymes. There are also important organic compounds. So before we go further, we define first monomers. Monomers are important small organic molecules. And when we say polymers, these are combination of monomers and also known as the macromolecules. The monosaccharides or glucose are the monomer of carbohydrates. The amino acid, the monomer of proteins. Fatty acids are the monomer of lipids. And the nucleotides are the monomers of nucleic acid. So let's start with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the simplest and most abundant organic compound and composed of elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Usually, carbohydrates are the primary product of photosynthesis, and it provides food to animals and are sources of energy for the activities of the cells, particularly animals and plant cells. Monosaccharides are the building blocks of carbohydrates. For example, glucose, the end product of digestion of carbohydrates. We have also fructose, which is a fruit sugar, galactose, which is a milk sugar, and a mannose. So these are examples of monosaccharides. Mono, that means single, and saccharide, meaning sugar. Another, we have disaccharides. Disaccharides are known as double sugar. Di meaning two. Composed of two simple sugars bonded together. Just like, for example, glucose and another glucose form maltose and water. So during the process, water is formed and it is called as dehydration synthesis. Another example of disaccharide is your sucrose, which is a combination of your monomer, glucose and fructose. The lactose, which is milk sugar, a combination of glucose and galactose. And the maltose, which is a malt sugar, a combination of two glucose. Note that before disaccharides can be used by organisms, they must be broken into monosaccharide units. Another type of carbohydrate is your polysaccharides, known as complex sugars. Polysaccharides made up of many glucose molecules that are bonded together in a long chain. We have several kinds of polysaccharides that are readily made available in our nature. We have starches, glycogen, and cellulose. Starches are plant food reserved and usually stored in the specialized organs of plants. Mostly, of course, in the leaves. And for root crops, of course, they are present in the roots of the plant. Second, we have glycogen. Glycogen are animal starch or the animal reserved, usually stored in the animal liver. Third, we have cellulose that are found in the cell wall of plant cells. And in order to utilize the polysaccharides, it must undergo hydrolysis or the breaking down of molecules by water. In general, the function of carbohydrates, short-term energy storage, it is converted to glucose quickly, and glucose is used to make adenosine triphosphate, and brain cells requires glucose. Another macromolecule is proteins. Proteins are polymers that contains carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. Amino acids are the building blocks of these proteins. And when we combine amino acids, it will produce a dipeptide. And if we combine dipeptides, it will produce a polypeptides. And a polypeptides will form proteins. Usually, of course, they are joined by a peptide bonds. In organic chemistry, amino acids contains an amine or the NH2 group and a carboxyl group. So amino acids aren't stored, so a daily supply is required. So this is an example of a polypeptide chains. Here, the two examples of amino acids. So each amino acid has an amine group or the NH2 and a carboxyl group, which is this one. NH2 and a carboxyl group. Here, the individual amino acids are joined together by a peptide bond. And during the reaction, it will release water. Important functions of proteins, it provides also energy in a long term. Enzymes and hormones are proteins. Antigens and antibodies are proteins. These are very important in our immune system, especially today we are experiencing the COVID pandemic. Also, immunoglobulins form a major line of defense against foreign organisms. Others are found in the cell membrane that acts as the channel and transporters of the molecules that usually in and out of the cell. Proteins are used to make skin, hair, nails, and muscles. Also present in hemoglobin, and it has an immune system functions. Also, proteins needed for muscle contractions. These are your actin and the myosin filaments and part of the cell membrane. The third macromolecules, is lipids. Lipids is a compound that are greasy in consistency and are insoluble in water, but readily soluble to organic solvents such as acetone and chloroform. The triglycerides are known as a simple lipid that is made up of two basic units: the alcohol, which is in the form of glycerol, and fatty acids. They exist as solid at room temperature, and these are fats, and liquid at room temperature, and these are oils. Characteristics of lipids: usually they have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The ratio of the hydrogen and oxygen is 2:1, and usually insoluble in water. Examples are fats, oils, cholesterol, triglycerides, and phospholipids that are present in our cell membrane. Glycerol and fatty acids are the building blocks of lipids. What are the functions of lipids? These are long-term energy storage. That is why lipids are usually accumulated in our adipose tissue or the fat tissue in our body. Also, lipids are very important in insulation against heat loss and protective cushions for organs so that our organs will not experience trauma. Another lipid is your cholesterol, that is part of our cell membrane structure and usually gives a integrity of our cell membrane, which other molecules cannot penetrate easily. Types of lipids, these are saturated and unsaturated. When we say saturated, the single covalent bonds between carbon atoms like beef, pork, whole milk, cheese, and eggs. When we say unsaturated, one or more double covalent bonds between carbons. These are olive oils, fish oil, sunflower oil, etc. Notice in this illustration, the 1-glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids are combined to produce a triglyceride molecule in the presence, of course, of enzyme to increase the activation energy of the reaction. This illustration gives us an idea regarding with the structure of a saturated and unsaturated fatty acids or lipids. An example of saturated is a palmic acid, and an unsaturated is the linoleic acid. As what I have mentioned earlier regarding with the phospholipids that are chiefly present in our cell membrane. So this is the structure of a molecular model of a phospholipid. This one. It has a polar head or the polar region, which is hydrophilic. That means loves water, and it is composed of phosphate region. Phosphate containing region. On the other hand, we have the tail, which is the nonpolar region, and usually hydrophobic. That means it hates water, and it is made up of fatty acid. Phospholipids in biological membranes have polar regions, as what I've said earlier, and the nonpolar tails that are tightly form the interior of the membrane. Steroids are organic compounds whose multiple rings share carbons. Example of steroids are your testosterone for the male that regulates the sexual development of male, and estrogen and progesterone both regulating the sexual development of females. Another, we have carotenoids. Carotenoids are family of light-absorbing pigments in plants and animals. Example of a carotenoid is your beta-carotene, which broken down into 2 vitamin A molecules from which it makes the pigment rhodopsin, which is required for vision. Lastly, we have the nucleic acids. Nucleic acids form from the monomer of nucleotides. Functions, usually for protein synthesis and heredity. And the polypeptides are building blocks of your nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are compounds that pass heredity, information, and from one generation to another generation, making possible the continuity of life. Of course, without nucleic acids, we don't have DNA. Nucleic acids composed primarily of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So, as what I've said, nucleotides are the building blocks and composed of the nitrogenous base, the phosphate, and a 5-carbon sugar. We have 2 types of nucleic acids, the DNA and the RNA. The DNA, or the deoxyribonucleic acid, which found in the nucleus of the cell, and it usually have the genetic materials or the genes of the animals and the plants. Also, we have the RNA or the ribonucleic acid, which is found both inside and outside of the cell. And we have different types of RNA. We have messenger RNA or the mRNA, the transfer RNA or the tRNA, and the ribosomal RNA or the rRNA. The difference between your deoxyribonucleic acid from your ribonucleic acid is that of the deoxygenated structure of sugar molecules. The sugar molecule present in your DNA is deoxyribose sugar, while in RNA is ribose sugar. This is a typical structure of a deoxyribonucleic acids, wherein we can observe the nitrogenous base, the ribose or the deoxyribose sugar of the DNA, and the phosphate group. So this is one strand of the DNA, and this one is another strand of DNA. And that ends my presentation on the chemical basis of life. Thank you for your kind attention. God bless and keep safe.